Rice, fish, and meat, rare commodities for thousands living in southern Madagascar. To feed their children, parents in rural areas resort to leaves, cactus fruits, and locusts. The UN's World Food Programme says that malnutrition among children under 5 has doubled in the last 4 months. In some districts, 1 in 4 children suffer from starvation.
The issue is no longer about how bad it is. It's extremely bad. Famine looms in southern Madagascar as communities witness an almost total disappearance of food sources.
In 2021, food production in Madagascar is expected to be nearly 40% below average. Drought and sandstorms have ruined crops and exacerbated the already devastating effects of climate change. This in one of Africa's poorest countries. More than 1 million people are now in need of food assistance.
Due to lack of resources, we have been providing only half rations across the community up to the tune of 700,000.
Over the last 4 decades, Madagascar's deep south has seen frequent episodes of drought and famine. But this year, the situation has become particularly dire. With limited access to markets, prices have spiked amid the coronavirus pandemic, and food has remained out of reach for thousands of people.
Northern Israel has killed at least 44 people. The crash happened at a gathering for tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews on Mount Meron. Our correspondent Harry Fawcett's near the scene. He's going to be updating us shortly. First, this report from Sarah Khairat.
Emergency services rushed to the scene where tens of thousands of ultra-Orthodox Jews had gathered for the Lag BaOmer annual pilgrimage. What started off as an all-night gathering of prayer and dance at the bonfire festival ended with these chaotic scenes. Bodies of those killed in a stampede are lined up. Hundreds of people are injured.
Provided first aid to those who were injured at the site. We sent out backup teams, 200 ambulances, motorcycles, mobile intensive care units, helicopters to the scene in order to transport and evacuate those who were injured and killed to the hospitals.
Considered to be one of the holiest sites for Jews, the tomb of the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is what brings the faithful here. Around 30,000 pilgrims were gathered on Mount Meron, 3 times the capacity of what was allowed by the authorities. Organisers say more than 650 buses had brought in people from across the country, making it the largest public gathering in Israel since the pandemic started.
All of a sudden we saw paramedics from Madda and whatever running by, like mid-CPR on kids, and then one after the other started coming out, ambulances, and then we understood like something's going on here.
Private bonfires at Mount Meron were banned last year due to coronavirus restrictions. The lockdown measures were eased this year after Israel's rapid COVID-19 vaccination program has seen more than 50% of the population fully vaccinated. Police say they've arrested 2 people for disrupting officers' efforts to keep order at the site. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has described the stampede as a heavy disaster. Sarah Khairat, Al Jazeera.
OK, let's talk to Harry Fawcett, who's on the scene. Harry, Sarah's package there just showing us some of the chaos and fear that there was at the event. What's the latest that we know about this?
Well, yes, it was a dreadful event, as you just saw in those pictures, and it's been written on the faces of some of the people we've been speaking to here as well. We had been barred from getting further access than this police checkpoint until just a couple of minutes ago when they've said that we can get further in. But all the way up to here, we've been seeing stragglers from the events overnight, trying to get lifts, getting on buses, and we've talked to a couple of them. One young man said that it was a crime carried out by the police, accusing the police of preventing people from getting access to one potential exit route out of the crush. Another man said that he had watched it take place from a distance and he saw people slipping down a series of steps on top of each other, and that it was an unavoidable consequence of that there were going to be deaths and injuries. I also asked him if he had ever felt unsafe at this event before. This is an event that attracts some 500,000 people over a series of days every year. Not last year because of the pandemic, but in a typical year. And he said yes. Every time he said it was a miracle that nothing like this had happened before because of the lack of organization, because of the difficulty of access for emergency services, and for the sheer sort of chaos and crush that attends each time that this biggest religious festival in Israel takes place. So as well as the buses which have been coming to evacuate the last remaining festival goers, there have also been buses bringing more police in to carry out a major investigation into how this happened, and there will be answers that will be sought from quarters, both in terms of the organizers, in terms of the police, in terms of the government, for allowing this to go ahead in such great numbers, in such a small, under-resourced, under-equipped, it seems, site.
Harry, I know we're going to be coming back to you in the next few hours as this unfolds, but for now, thanks very much indeed. Palestine's first parliamentary elections in 15...
Well, it's not exactly clear what it means. What we know, what I can tell you, is that President Felix Tshisekedi cites Article 85 of the Constitution, which states that, I quote, if severe circumstances immediately threaten the independence or integrity of the national territory, then the president may proclaim a state of siege or a state of emergency. Now, of course, the government hasn't said exactly what this measure would entail. More details are expected in the coming hours via a presidential decree, which is expected to be issued later this Saturday. In any case, it's worth mentioning that the announcement comes just days after Prime Minister Sama Lukonde suggested putting in place a state of emergency in the east of the country to stop the deadly violence there. The Prime Minister suggesting replacing the civil administration with a military administration and beefing up military presence in the area.
Now, Clément, why now? Why is this measure being adopted at this particular moment in time?
Well, there have been almost daily protests in North Kivu and in Ituri since the beginning of April, particularly in the cities of Bunia, Beni, Butembo, and Goma. These protests have at times been violent, and they've drawn hundreds or thousands of protesters demanding an end to insecurity in the east of the country, demanding an end to the bloodshed, and also some accusing the MONUSCO, the UN force in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and the Congolese army of failing to protect them. Now, it's worth highlighting, as you mentioned, that the region has indeed been plagued by decades of chronic violence and instability. An estimated 122 armed groups are said to be operating in the region. Some of them are accused of carrying out atrocities against the population. The most striking example would be the Allied Democratic Forces, the ADF, a group which is originally from Uganda and has killed hundreds of civilians since 2014. The group has been accused by some countries, including the US, of having links to the Islamic State group. And the Congolese president, Felix Tshisekedi himself, has described this group, the ADF, as a terrorist group, and he's promised to do everything he can to eradicate it and also to bring peace to the east of the country.
No one is questioning that ceasefire agreements and peace talks between the Myanmar army and some of the major armed ethnic groups are now either paused or outright dead. About a dozen rebel groups have announced their support for the anti-coup uprising on the streets, some even protecting protesters from security forces as the crackdown became more violent. There are nearly 24 armed ethnic groups, mostly in the borderlands, that for decades have been fighting the Myanmar military for greater autonomy. Some feel that while each of the ethnic armies has their own objectives, the current situation could draw them together as they coordinate against the military. It might be a short-lived, loose alliance, though, as there are many rivalries and individual agreements between them. But there's a new element: the urban-based protesters, mostly from the majority Bamar ethnicity, who are now banding together with the minority communities. And in some cases, as this video appears to show, young protesters have gone from street protesting to joining rebel army camps in the jungle to train as fighters.
What is new now is the city people that they understand the plight of the ethnic armed group, why they fight for, right? They are not fighting for dividing the country, but they are fighting for their autonomous and then the democratic governing system.
Some of the rebel armies see the current crisis as an opportunity to step up attacks on army positions, like one of the strongest, the KNU, a group representing the Karen minority in its territory near the border with Thailand. Earlier in the week, its fighters attacked and captured an army outpost along the river border. The military has stepped up air attacks on Karen-held territory, injuring civilians and sending many fleeing for safety. In the north, Kachin rebels have also increased their attacks on the army. And like the Karen, they have also faced an increase in air assaults. Even if all the estimated 75,000 rebels band together, they'd still be facing a 350,000 strong army. Despite being outnumbered, it's thought that if the pace of urban unrest continues and the rebels step up their attacks, it could stretch the army. Something that the newly formed unity government of ousted politicians and ethnic leaders hopes to do by creating a federal army. Scott Heidler, Al Jazeera.
Ethnic insurgents patrol the Salween River, separating Myanmar from Thailand. Thousands of people from the country's southeastern Karen state have fled across the border amid clashes between the military and local rebels.
We fled across the river. People said the army will come and shoot us.
Thailand's government said more than 2,200 people crossed the border on Thursday alone. More are expected to join them if fighting intensifies.
Thailand is providing humanitarian support and, if needed, medical treatment for these Myanmar persons fleeing unrest or fighting in the humanitarian area designated for this anticipated scenario.
Myanmar's military has carried out a number of airstrikes in the region this week after Karen ethnic rebels overran an army base. Meanwhile, 2 Air Force bases in the centre of the country were targeted by rockets on Thursday, though it's unclear who carried out the attack. Myanmar has seen a surge in clashes between the military and various ethnic insurgent groups following the military coup on the 1st of February, which sparked widespread demonstrations. Various rebel armies have backed the protest movement. The spike in violence has prompted warnings of the crisis spiralling into civil war. The United Nations say 56,000 people have been displaced by the unrest.
Overwhelmed by the COVID pandemic, it's easy to forget that India's also one of the biggest manufacturers and exporters of vaccines that have been protecting people from the virus elsewhere. But as the COVID crisis worsens, those exports are being curbed, creating a void that experts say is now being filled by China, India's arch rival. At a video conference this week, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi told his South Asian counterparts that Beijing was ready to help in any way it could, a spokesman making clear this was a long-term commitment.
This includes opening our door for the participation of South Asian countries, including India. We will also make positive efforts to help the relevant regional countries in their fight against the pandemic for the region.
India, though, was not represented at the virtual conference, a reflection of recent violent border skirmishes between Chinese and Indian troops. John Burns wrote a case study for a new book called Coronavirus Politics and says China's only acting out of self-interest.
It can be dressed up however you want, but making the world safe for dictatorship, that's what it's all about.
That's the game.
That's the game, absolutely. And China's playing it well.
The danger now is the virus spreads rapidly to nearby countries. It is clear from state-controlled media that China's leaders are watching developments in India very closely, because China shares a border not just with India, but also with 3 other countries where infection rates are rising: Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nepal. And there was a wake-up call here in Hong Kong just a few weeks ago when a flight arrived from New Delhi with more than 50 passengers on board who tested positive for COVID-19. China, like Russia, the United States and India, has been selling or donating its vaccines to countries around the world, giving rise to the term vaccine diplomacy. In Pakistan, China's already taken a leading role in supplying millions of its jabs, with more expected this week. One of more than 50 countries, says China's government, who've received their vaccines for free. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
Rio de Janeiro's iconic Copacabana beach, covered with hundreds of body bags, a tribute to the 400,000 Brazilians who lost their lives to COVID-19.
We cannot accept these deaths quietly. If we do, we will be accomplices of the crimes committed by those who govern us. That's why we staged this awareness campaign.
Antônio Carlos blames President Jair Bolsonaro for downplaying the virus and delaying the vaccine rollout.
Em plena pandemia.
While people were dying and starving, he was riding a jet ski and participating in anti-democratic protests to shut down Congress and the Supreme Court. But he was only able to do this because he still has the support of many Brazilians.
Every hour, the group held a symbolic funeral, a reminder that the pandemic in Brazil is spreading rapidly and is far from over. Vaccine shortages have put the inoculation campaign on hold in many cities. Brazil's health minister, Marcelo Queiroga, made an appeal during a World Health Organization briefing on Friday.
We're calling again on those who have vaccine surplus to share it with Brazil as soon as possible so we can move forward, broaden our vaccination campaign, contain the pandemic at this critical time, and avoid the proliferation of new variants.
Brazil is the second country in the world to have reached the grim milestone of 400,000 deaths by COVID-19. But it's not the only country in the region facing difficulties. Latin America as a whole is taking a turn for the worse.
The region accounts for more than 1/3 of coronavirus deaths in the world, but only has 1/8 of the population.
Today, most of the countries in the southern cone and the Andean region are going through new peaks of transmission. Countries like Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Argentina, Uruguay, and Guyana are reporting a dramatic rise in infections, and their health services are overwhelmed.
Infections in Colombia are also rising, and hospitals in big cities like Bogotá and Medellín are running out of beds. Monica Yanakiev, Al Jazeera, Rio de Janeiro.
The largest vaccination drive in the world is underway. Some 600 million people in India are now eligible to get a COVID-19 vaccine, but the country's inoculation campaign is off to a slow start.
We are fully prepared. Our healthcare workers are ready for the vaccine drive, but we don't have vaccines.
India manufactures doses developed by AstraZeneca and its own vaccine Covaxin, and yet several states have warned they do not have enough shots. The Indian government says it has invested massively to ramp up production, but at a rate of around 75 million doses produced each month, it would take years to inoculate the entire adult population, some 940 million people. Drug companies have also accused the United States of hogging supplies of raw materials. Facing acute shortages, vaccination centers have been closed across the country.
We are requesting the people of Karnataka, especially those who are above 18 years up to 44 years, to refrain from going to the hospitals thinking that you may be vaccinated.
It comes as India grapples with the worst outbreak yet. Dozens of countries have offered their assistance, sending oxygen cylinders and other medical equipment to overwhelmed hospitals. But amid a wave of solidarity, governments have also moved to restrict travel from India. The U.S. has announced that foreign travelers arriving from the virus-hit country will be banned, while Australia has paused all flights, warning that nationals who fail to comply could face a 5-year prison sentence.
Well, like you mentioned, Thomas, North Korea has lashed out at the U.S. following Mr. Biden's comments in his address to Congress. Most poignantly, they said that what he said is simply Mr. Biden's attempt to continue enforcing a U.S. hostile policy against North Korea. We heard from Mr. Kwon Jong-gu, who is essentially the foreign ministry in North Korea's point man on the United States. And those comments were printed in state media today. And he explained that because Mr. Biden has made these remarks has suggested that North Korea's what North Korea calls its deterrence, its nuclear program, is in fact a threat. That Mr. Biden and Washington only stand to continue to be an aggressor, and that North Korea will have to respond in kind somehow, a corresponding action, he said, because it's obvious the U.S. threat, as North Korea called it, is not going to end under Mr. Biden's administration.
And secondly, Bruce, just how have Joe Biden's advisors been describing this apparent shift in US policy towards the North, with the president, as you were mentioning, of course, commenting on North Korea in his first address to Congress on Wednesday?
Well, in that address, Thomas, he mentioned both Iran and North Korea and said that the United States, is going to work against these threats by diplomatic means as well as stern deterrence. And that's nothing new when it comes to describing policy against North Korea. Both diplomatic tracks as well as deterrence have been taken before, both under former President Donald Trump and former President Barack Obama, and even further back under former President George H.W. Bush. His administration is trying to distinguish its path forward by saying we won't be Mr. Obama with strategic patience, essentially waiting out sanctions to see if they bring North Korea to its knees and give up its nuclear program. And we won't be Mr. Trump, who promised a grand bargain through top-down diplomacy. We're going to be somewhere in the middle. But that still leaves a lot of questions, and we haven't seen the full details, the finer details of this policy plan. Maybe it goes back to what they call working level talks. They try and decide piece by piece how they can give up part of the nuclear program for some sanctions relief. But there's no significant nuance that I can see in their approach so far. And North Korea's response, I think, is an indication of that. They don't seem to see any change. They still feel that the United States is threatening them. So we may see some sort of, as Mr. Kwon Jong-gu called it, a corresponding measure in the near future.
Bruce Harris.
Tear gas in Paris, an all too familiar sight. France's May Day demonstrations are, traditionally, a show of force by the country's mighty trade unions. A message for the government that power lies not with politicians, but with people. This year, labour unions were joined by members of the Gilets jaunes, or Yellow Vest movement, that kicked off a wave of anti-government protests 3 years ago. The French President Emmanuel Macron remains under mounting pressure to abandon economic and social reforms as the country reels from 3 crippling coronavirus lockdowns. For some, this was about more than workers' rights. It was a show of rage.
May Day is a historic gathering, but it has a global context. We keep on having protests, and then we feel like protests happen for nothing. No one's listening to us. But I think it's important to keep coming back.
In the British capital, hundreds gathered in Trafalgar Square under the banner "Kill the Bill" against a proposed law that would give police extra powers to curb protests. It's feared the changes will have a chilling effect on the right to demonstrate. Among the crowds, Black Lives Matter supporters and climate change campaigners Extinction Rebellion, who paralysed parts of London in 2019. Under the proposed laws, people could face 10 years in prison for defacing monuments and large fines for breaching noise limits.
Inevitably, I think this is state repression. Yeah, this is the government saying that we don't want you to come out and voice your concerns against the system.
What these demonstrators are keen to remind the British government is that protests, by their very nature, are disruptive, and that any new laws designed to curtail people's right of assembly damage the country's democracy. In the German capital, Berlin, a peaceful march by protesters on the eve of May Day demanding affordable homes after the Constitutional Court overturned a law that set a rent cap on apartments in the city. 85% of Berliners rent rather than own their own home. 3 countries, 3 different struggles, but a common thread. These are the faces of Europe's young. Students, those struggling to find work, others looking for security in a fragile labour market.
Workers and students, rise and fight!
As Europe starts to emerge from lockdown, a reminder that many old frustrations haven't gone away, and in some cases, they've deepened. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, London.
anger on the streets of the Colombian capital. This is just one of protests nationwide that have lasted for 4 days now, against government fiscal reform that opponents say that amid the pandemic is just too much to bear.
It is incredible that in this crisis we're experiencing this violence that the country is going through, and the government carries out a tax reform and ends up impoverishing the people even more.
At times, the protests have turned deadly, with isolated looting, vandalism and accusations of police violence from human rights organisations as both sides clashed in several cities. In the face of pressure not just from the public but the opposition and politicians in his own party, President Ivan Duque announced on Friday that the reform would be revised.
The basic family budget of Colombians will not be touched. There will be no VAT on public services or on fuel, among other things. In this matter, the rules of the game that the country has today are simply not altered.
Duque still insists that the reform is badly needed to right the country's finances and had been meant to raise some $6.3 billion over the next decade to maintain its credit rating and fund its social services.
President Cyril Ramaphosa is the highest-ranking official to testify at an ongoing inquiry into corruption in South Africa. Many blame Ramaphosa's own party, the African National Congress, for much of the graft which, according to reports, runs into billions of dollars over several years. Much of the looting is alleged to have taken place when Ramaphosa's predecessor, Jacob Zuma, was president. Zuma resigned in 2018.
There has been recognition of the malaise of corruption in the ANC. We're robed with the powers of the state and the ability to manage resources, dispense, patronage, and all that. And we've accepted and admitted in the past that that has resulted in a number of deviant type behaviors.
Zuma's refused to return to testify at the inquiry, saying he's being vilified. It's alleged that Zuma's relationships with the business family led to the abuse of state-owned enterprises and influenced the appointment of officials to serve their business interests. And that corruption filtered through the ranks of the ANC.
We've seen the price that is being paid by the people as a whole, as they are deprived of good service delivery because the resources are being diverted, they're being plundered.
The ANC's lost support in recent years, and many had hoped that Ramaphosa, who was deputy president at the time, would explain what he did to try to stop corruption. But some argue he was not questioned hard enough and instead responded strategically.
The ANC is going to have some gains as a brand from this exercise. There are no further losses that Jacob Zuma can suffer. And also, I think that if the commission does its work well, it will shine a spotlight on those structural issues in the ANC that will show that a leopard cannot change its spots.
Ramaphosa has promised to fight corruption in South Africa, but his success is hinged on the party he leads rooting out corruption within its own ranks. Famine Miller, Al Jazeera, Johannesburg.
A draft bill to beef up counter-terror laws in France. The text comes after a spate of terror attacks in the country, including at a police station last week. According to the French Interior Minister, the new law will help modernize methods of counter-intelligence.
Après l'humain, il y a le technique et la technologique, qui est un moment aussi extrêmement important de ce projet. Il s'agit de suivre les nouvelles technologies telles qu'elles existent et qu'elles sont désormais utilisées par les terroristes, qui utilisent de moins en moins le téléphone, les lignes dites normales ou les SMS, mais de plus en plus Internet et notamment les connexions sur Internet.
The draft legislation includes provisions to extend house arrests for suspected terrorists and use algorithms to monitor websites. According to technology experts, the move from the French government will affect democracy and do very little to combat terrorism.
They don't understand technology. They never studied technology.
even their closest advisor have absolutely no understanding of technology, but they truly believe that there is something that technology can bring them to have a definitive answer on political problem.
4 years ago, France enacted a counter-terror law to replace a state of emergency after a string of terror attacks in 2015. According to the government, strengthening existing laws will help raise red flags. This as 9 of the last attacks in France were carried out by individuals unknown to the authorities.